People on live stream, welcome to today's Planning Essentials seminar, which is titled Drafting Clear and Concise Assessment Reports. Our presenters are Natalie and Hannah from Wolter Consulting Group and Troy Webb, a partner of McCulloch Robertson. As I've explained, we're holding the seminar here and being transmitted via webcast. I'm Stephen Warner and I'll be your chair and the moderator for this evening. Now, before we get started, I point out some of the interactive features of the webcam for those that are watching through that right now. And right below me, and it says point downwards, next to the timeline, you'll notice a speech bubble. That's to ask questions. If you'd like to pose a question at any time, please, during this webcast, just click on the speech bubble and fill out the form, then click send. I think it's important you also include your name in that and your email address. We'll take questions at the end of the seminar, so please send questions for those on the webinar to send questions at any time. The other people here will answer those questions and your questions at the end of the two presentations, and we'll have an open mic session with Q&A. And if those on the web need any further assistance, you can email at support@gigtv.com.au. So let's get started. Drafting clear and concise assessment reports that deliver the message to the target audience is an essential skill for planners. Tonight we have three very good presenters to discuss this. I'll introduce our first two speakers, Natalie Rayment and Hannah Sealey. Natalie is a practicing town planner and a director of the Wolter Consulting Group. She's also a member of the Property Council's Committee for Cities and is the co-founder of YIMBY Queensland. She's been practicing in Brisbane for over 20 years, working in both private companies, state and local government, so the full breadth of areas to be working as a planner. Hannah is a practicing town planner also at Wolter Consulting Group and also brings with her prior experience in state and local governments in Victoria and Queensland, so a very broad breadth. She's been, since joining with the Wolter Group, she's been heavily involved in an initiative to improve the consistency and quality of all the documentation across each of the company's discipline areas. Hannah is also currently coaching the planning team in the use of open source geographic information system software, helping the company to prepare powerful mapping which can really help tell the story, which might come out as they go their presentation. So I ask you to please welcome Natalie and Hannah.
Thank you very much, Stephen. It's a nice introduction. Thanks, everyone, for coming along to our presentation. And as you're right, I'll just click in. Thank you, that's fine. So, as Stephen introduced the topic to you, its title is Crafting Essential Assessment Reports. And I guess when we were asked to speak on this topic, we thought we would come to the topic from a private practitioner's perspective. So that's essentially what Hannah and I want to talk about today. And we're quite passionate about the topic. I think, as you heard, Hannah's been doing a lot of work within our organisation to make sure we're following best practice in this area. So it's very front of mind for us at the moment as well. So I guess our task is to test that premise of whether writing clear and concise reports for the audience and getting our message across as effectively as possible is an essential skill for planners. And I think we all know that that's true, but hopefully we'll walk you through that topic, and we'll all be convinced that this is, you know, one of the fundamental topics for planners. It's what we do. So what we wanted to talk about is, I guess as an overview, is who are we writing our reports for? Do we know who we're talking to when we're putting pen to paper or typing away? Who's actually reading it? How we might get our message across most effectively to sell the good points, I guess to sell the story. It's the premise, the story is in the telling, and that's what we want to talk about today, and avoiding the culture of defensiveness that can creep into our reports because of the process and the statutory regime that we're under. We want to talk about watching our language. It's not always black and white, and how a picture can tell 1,000 words. So, just to keep it interesting, we just wanted to throw a few things out there to begin with. And I guess as our presentation evolves, hopefully some of these left field ideas will have some more meaning. So firstly, it's what we can all learn from Harry Potter, the boy wizard, about report writing. So that's one thing we'll have a look at. Why a cake mix box is quite an important tool in our toolbox, and how you can hopefully get some inspiration from Yimby, yes, in my backyard. So to start off with, I thought let's have a look at this topic from our audience perspective. And I'm sure it's not, rocket science to work out who the audience is when we're writing reports, but I think it's important to just, remind ourselves every now and then that we've got a primary audience, or first and foremost, who's in our mind when we're writing our reports, and then, who else is looking at our reports, and once you start thinking about that, there's a bit of a ripple effect. So why this is important, obviously, is we need to make sure we're writing our reports for the audience that's going to read it. And that's a challenge for us as planners because, we're cutting across so many issues. So I guess first and foremost, we are writing our report from a planning practitioner's point of view for our client. We've been engaged by our client. It's the deliverable, it's the output that we're being paid to do when we're preparing a development application and managing that process. So our client is essentially commissioning our report, and we're writing it for the assessing authority. So we're writing an assessment report because we're lodging a development application that we hope will be approved. So it's really a tool to convey that proposal, the good aspects of it, the technical aspects of it, why it should be approved, so the reasons for approval. And we're talking to our assessing officer and the decision maker. Now, the next beyond that, first and foremost, there's certainly plenty of other players in the development assessment game, we know that. So there's the consultant team. The rest of our consultant team need to be on the same page for consistency, and their expertise will input somewhere into that report. So it's the consultant team or the project team, it's the community, as we know, it's the next door neighbour. Sometimes I think they're probably reading our report even more than anyone else. And there's the wider community, there's community groups. There's politicians, and they might be there representing their community, or they're there as decision makers. And then if your decision ends up in appeal, there's a whole new team that are going to be looking at that. And that's not just one team, but the team on both sides. So it's your legal team, your solicitor, the other experts, the lay witnesses, the barrister, and then the barrister that's going to be cross-examining you. So at that point, you have to be very careful about every word that you've written in that report, because someone will ask you what you meant by that. What did that word mean, that phrase mean? How did you get to that conclusion? And I guess third ripple out, which is where I'll end it in terms of the audience, is that our report, so it's a little bit different than verbal communication. Today I know who I'm talking to, you're sitting in the room, or I can have a look at who's on the other end of that camera. But it's the spoken word. We're talking to someone, we're at a meeting with someone, negotiating with someone, but our report is going up on the internet for everyone to read in this day of IT and technology. So in most jurisdictions, we'll be lodging our application with our reports, goes up on the internet, and it's freely accessible to everyone. So anyone and everyone could be reading our report, but also our employer or the business that we work for. It's part of our branding, it's part of our reputation, it's part of the QA system. Hopefully it's not the insurance agency. So, you know, there's a lot of people that are going to be reading this report, and it's also our peers. We might be looking at the application that's going on next door to our site. So it's, you know, it's our peers in the industry as well. So it's very important that we know all of that, and then we break that down and say, you know, what are they doing with our report? We know that not everyone's going to read our reports from cover to cover. I think it's probably fair to say that no one is going to read our report from cover to cover, except maybe the barrister that's going to cross-examine us or the next door neighbour. So it's also about making sure that we're putting that information out in a way that's easy to find where the relevant bits are for that audience. So I think that's, you know, a really fundamental thing just to think about always when you're writing something, is who's reading it, what you're writing it for, and there's a few messages in there that we'll work through, but you need to mean what you say, and, you know, it is a way of structuring you know, your arguments. So Harry Potter, I guess I wanted to say that you're going to learn a lot from Harry Potter, not the boy wizard, but from the story itself. And I guess we've all got lessons we can learn from the master storyteller, J.K. Rowling. So I think when we're writing a report, one of the things that is you know, important, and we'll learn it in Planning 101, is that we need to be thorough, we need to cover every thing that, you know, in every assessment benchmark. We need to be concise while we're doing that, which is a challenge when the assessment benchmarks are growing, and we need to be technically proficient. But I think what's important, and perhaps what we don't often do well as an industry, is we're actually storytellers. If you look on Wikipedia and want to know what a town planner is, and obviously that's not the best source, but it's a popular source and a source that you can sort of understand maybe what the community thinks. They talk about a few things, but one of the main things is that we are effective communicators. We're essentially advocating, negotiating, problem solving, but at the end of the day we're selling a proposal, we're selling a city, we're selling a vision that we want to achieve. And so really a fundamental part of report writing is storytelling. So if you have a look at J.K. Rowling's skills in storytelling, and she has been analysed to death by all sorts of people, from marketing to, you know, universities. They talk about four things. She's fantastic at characterisation, so her characters jump from the page and they're relatable. And so I guess we can take from that when we're writing an assessment report, we are writing the story of the character in our story, which is the development proposal. So we need to make that proposal jump out of the page. We need to describe it, but make it relatable. What's good about this development? Why is it a great development? Why are we proposing it? Let's build a story around that. She's also good at what they call world building, and obviously she's creating a different world. We're describing the environment or the setting that our proposal is going into. So we also need that to be, you know, clear, detailed. We need to really understand that context. So it's very relevant to us as planners. She has a gripping beginning. She catches your attention, and that's one of the things that we will talk about, but we believe that right up front we've got to sell what are the benefits of the proposal. We've got to be, you know, gripping right at the beginning why this is a good development in the location that we're proposing it, and that's important. That shouldn't be something that you get to at the end of your report. That should be right up front. And she has a powerful ending, so we still need to be able to back that up. We need to, you know, have a structure. We need to have the technical information in there and pull some powerful punches at the end. The cake mix box. So I think this is another tool that's handy probably in life, but more importantly today for our reports. And it's about really having a think about what's going to make it to the front of that cake mix box. So we think we're regulated highly, perhaps. Some people maybe don't think we're regulated enough, but either way, there's a lot of regulation in town planning. Equally so in products and consumerism. So this company would have to meet a whole lot of standards, and they would have to, as mandatory, to tell you those things on their box, things like weight, ingredients, nutritional content. Not many of those things make it to the front, and I think that's the important thing in key messaging. Have a think about what it is that's the key message, bring that right to the front, and make sure you're making a big point of that. Obviously, you've got to also have all those technical details, and like the box, it's all down the side, you know where to go and find that, so structure's important as well, and it needs to have that technical content, but have a think about what's jumping out on the front of your cake mix box. Quality, value, what it is, why it looks amazing. Then I wanted to just touch on, before I hand over to Hannah, that I think sometimes there's a little bit of a tendency to be defensive in our report writing. And I know that that's not something specific that you can put your finger on. I think sometimes that's a bigger issue in planning. We're often defending why we're proposing something that's not the exact fit of the acceptable outcomes. And I think that's the reverse. We should be really saying why it was a great outcome to achieve a performance outcome here, why that is the great solution for this site. So it's about, don't lose sight of the positives, and don't write in the defense, put it out there. I think it's more than a story of compliance versus non-compliance. So I think that's really just reinforcing the point that let's pull out all the good values of a proposal, why it's a good development in the right location, and then get into the details. And part of that message is also watch your language. This is probably one of my biggest bugbears, and I see it in planners, I see it in politicians, I see it in communities. How can a community possibly understand performance-based planning if we're talking in maximums, we're talking in limits? There's no such thing as a limit in a performance-based system. So let's not talk about things as height limits, as parking minimums or maximums. They're guides, they're acceptable outcomes. You can go and call them one way of achieving something, whatever you want to call it, but don't call it a limit or a maximum, because it just confuses everybody in this process that we're in. So watch your language, not just maximum and minimums. Obviously we need to be concise, we need to pull things down, and I think mean what we say. Remember, the barrister's going to read what you've written. I'm going to hand over to Hannah. Thank you.
Right, I'll just jump right in where Natalie left off. So keeping score, having a template and a QA checklist. What we're talking about here is that it can be really important to have a system which aids consistency, getting a consistent brand across your company, making the report writing process more efficient, and making sure that our planning reports are really comprehensive. So a system that can achieve all of this could include a template, a supporting report writing guideline, and then a QA checklist. So I'll go through what each of those sets out to do. So a template is basically a tool that looks at automating your company-wide style guide, and it also looks at establishing a bit of a company brand which is uniform across all the reports going out within that company. It might also include some instructions and hints for the people that are using them, that sort of directs them to what goes in each section and helps them to also just use consistent terminology throughout. So, if one person's saying a material change of use for such and such, and they're spelling out the full term, and then the planner next to them is doing it in a different way, then it just doesn't get the company brand across in a consistent manner. The other thing that a template can do is save us a lot of time by automating standard content. So what I'm talking about here, a lot of people aren't familiar with, and it's a particular tab in Microsoft Suite called the Developer tab, which allows you to insert basically controls into your document. So at Wolter's, Natalie mentioned that we've been doing a lot of work on updating all of our templates, improving them, making sure they're best practice. So we've really started at the ground level. We've looked at planning reports produced within separate planning teams within our company, and then we've also looked at planning reports produced by other firms. We've taken what we think is best practice from all of them and then refined it even further, gone through a comprehensive QA, and we've just tried to time it with the new Act coming out recently, and so we've now got a brand new planning report which tries to do all of that. But basically, through that process, we identified sections of our report and a lot of companies' reports that are exactly the same every time the report gets written, maybe except for a word here or there. So what we've actually done is created chunks of text which effectively become options, and the user can then select a drop-down box which then populates that section of the report with those minor changes. So you save a lot of time by doing that and not having to go back, find a previous report, copy and paste. And any good template, I think, needs a supporting report writing guideline. So while a template can have some basic instructions, you don't want to clog up your template with instructions. So having a document that sits next to it and which actually gives a more detailed overview of what goes in each section. So for example, if you're writing an executive summary, that's something that a lot of people kind of balk at writing and they're not quite sure what goes in it when they should write it. That's the perfect kind of topic for a report writing guideline. You can give really good, strong examples of a good one. You can give people hints and reminders about best planning practice, and then you can actually condense that into what we've called here a QA checklist. So the QA checklist will basically be a summary of everything you've suggested a user does in your report writing guidelines. So your QA checklist will ask questions like, have you considered your audience and tailored your content accordingly? Or does your site analysis avoid overemphasis on the site constraints and remember to also point out the positive attributes of the site location? So that's basically where we're going with keeping score. It's about having that system and making sure you're going to get something consistent, which saves you time, make sure you've got branding, and really just automates things. So Natalie touched on this, the stories and the telling, and she spoke a lot about why this is really important. So I'm going to try and give you a bit more of an overview of how you can put that into practice, and I'll talk about three key tools, being key messaging, having a bank of phrases, and using powerful images. So key messaging is basically the positive core messages that you want someone to remember after they've read your report. Natalie spoke about needing to have a gripping start and a gripping finish, and the key messaging is the way you do that. You introduce your key messages up front, you repeat them throughout the document, and then you bring it home at the end with those key messages. So that allows you to control the communication and influence your reader's perception. And you should come up with those key messages before you even start writing, because otherwise you really can't get that direction and flow through your report. So some of these terms that are on this slide are some of the ways that we can do this. So as with the reference before to J.K. Rowling, descriptive statements, if you construct sentences that allow the person who's reading your report to really visualize exactly what you're talking about, that's a lot more powerful than sort of dull language which describes the height of a building. So through that kind of expressive language and really detailed explanations which help people to visualize, and if you support all of that with evidence, so evidence we're talking reference to consultant reports and the use of imagery, then you're going to end up with something that's a lot more persuasive than just sort of boring or dull sentences which describe the physical characteristics of a development. So this is what I'm calling a bank of phrases. This is, in this case, inspired by the 4 pillars of YIMBY, which are design excellence, innovation, sustainability, and community dividend. So we sort of went through an exercise of coming up with a lot of buzzwords, I guess you could call them, that are kind of attached to each of these 4 pillars. And I think something as simple as having words like this in front of you when you're writing a report will make you remember all of the positive attributes of a proposal and therefore avoid focusing on what you're trying to address, any, not non-compliance, because we're not using those terms as Natalie said, but anywhere where you're not meeting an acceptable outcome. It helps you to stop focusing on that, but start focusing on what's actually good about this proposal and getting those really key core messages coming through loud and clear. And also some of these words, automatically create an association in your reader's mind about good planning practice. You see words like walkability, you're thinking, yeah, tick, that's a great attribute. So I recommend having a bank of words in front of you. A picture tells 1,000 words. Basically, images can be really powerful tools, and sometimes they should replace chunks of text, and maybe not entirely, but sometimes it can mean that you can reduce your text to a couple of sentences and then do all of the explaining with the imagery. So I'm talking photos, I'm talking architectural and landscape renders and plans, and I'm talking maps. So I just put together a few examples of where imagery can be really powerful. The one on the top left is a map that we put together recently, which was trying to demonstrate the locational advantages of a site. So it basically plots out where the public transport is situated, so the rail stations, the busways, the bus stations, and then it also highlights a number of points of interest which are key services that the site has convenient access to. And by doing that and then plotting the radius, it just really shows, without including 2 paragraphs of text, that this site has a lot of locational advantages. The one below it was produced using the same software, and it was one where we were trying to demonstrate that a wildlife corridor could be provided across our site without extending unnecessarily or encroaching onto, in this case it was an oval and a service road that would have otherwise needed to be deleted to accommodate that corridor. And obviously you can use words and say, yep, we can fit a 60-metre corridor, no problems, but it's a lot more believable if you can show it. And just a bit of an aside on those 2 images I've just gone through, those have both been produced with open source GIS software, so that's completely freely available for download. And it's a lot more user-friendly than a lot of people might think. I know when I went through university, everything was a very difficult-to-use software program. This open source stuff that's coming out at the moment, particularly QGIS is what we've started using at Wolters, is very user-friendly. And there's a lot you can do with it. So in that bottom one, we've introduced the local council's overlays as a layer. We've also then inserted our site plan and the site plan of the development to the north, and we've what we call geo-reference, basically just changing the location of that imagery on the map so that it fits in the property boundaries, and then we've simply just drawn the corridor and said, here it is, here's the measurement, it fits. So I'd encourage people to look into that, and I just say that there's no need to outsource mapping these days. Any planner can be doing this. People at Wolter are actually picking it up surprisingly quickly. I expected a lot of people to sort of balk at it and think, no, that's a bit hard. Hannah, please stop trying to tell us how to use this. But people have picked it up and it's been surprising. So then if I move over to the right side, obviously that top one is an architectural render. That's of Grace on Coronation, which was a development Wolters managed the application for in Toowong. And obviously a picture like that just looks really great, and you could sit there and describe that in words for days and it still wouldn't convey the same message that that image does. And then the one below is just an extract from Virtual Brisbane, which is a tool that Brisbane Council are using now to understand the shadowing, orientation and height impacts of buildings. So obviously that's, again, a really useful tool which shows that images are going to be really important in the way we do planning. And just to finish off, just a bit of a reminder, more than anything else, that it's not always black and white. So what we mean by this is that it's really easy to refer to an opinion as a fact in a report, and it's a trap a lot of us fall into. So instead of saying something like the development will generate 1,400 trips per day in the morning and afternoon peak hours, you would say according to the traffic impact assessment, and then finish the sentence. So just really being aware that not everything that you're taking out of a consultant or a supporting report is fact. It's sometimes an opinion based on an assessment of that. And I'll just hand back to Natalie to finish off.
Thanks very much. So we just wanted to wrap up, I guess, with that last point I mentioned at the beginning. So hopefully YIMBY can do a little bit of inspiration in our report writing. So we have left a little YIMBY page on everyone's chair, and we'll have this up on the YIMBY website if anyone's interested in having a look at it. And I guess the point that we were making is that we think that, I guess, you know, there's an important message behind YIMBY. YIMBY is Yes in My Backyard. It's a movement. It's not, you know, just us. It's something that people are talking about all around the world, and it's a platform to balance the conversation about urban development out there, which can be very negative in the media, you know, in neighbourhood disputes, I guess, about development proposals, and often very reactionary. So, you know, we felt like it was important to balance this conversation, and so it's a little bit of a call to arms to planners and other urban property industry professionals to, you know, be proud about the work that we do, and when there are good development outcomes, let's talk about them in a positive light and share that message. So while, you know, that's a platform of its own, how it might relate here to report writing is that we think at the end of the day, under the Planning Act, the assessment of an application, there's a process there, but when there's a decision, there was always a lot of reasoning put into reasons for refusal if the decision was to say no. And if the decision was to say yes, it was just, here's your approval and your conditions. Certainly, you know, that's a lot more complicated than that, and there's assessment reports, I appreciate that. But for the community, that's all they were seeing. They were seeing an approval, and they were seeing a set of conditions, and they weren't understanding why. So I guess we're just putting it out there that YIMBY supports this new initiative, that under the Planning Act, the reasons why a development is being approved also needs to be included in decision notices. And so if it's a part of the council's decision notice, then it's really our responsibility as planning practitioners to suggest some of those reasons in our report. You know, it's the reasons that we're putting forward that proposal because, you know, we're not in the business of lodging applications that we think are going to be refused. So let's have a think about what the reasons for approval are and write them clearly into our report. And part of that is, you know, right up front in the reasons that we're saying that development is a good development. Now, while there's a lot of statutory rules around decision notices and what information has to go into that, you know, issuing of a development permit and the reasons for approval, all we're suggesting at YIMBY is let's also take a bit of an opportunity to share some of the great things that are coming out of development. So if there is an opportunity to talk about you know, the positives of a development outcome, let's talk about them there. Let's talk about them in our report. Let's talk about them at the backyard barbecue. Let's get talking about how great our industry is and what we're doing. And if we need some structure around that, YIMBY's tried to put them into 4 categories. So good development might mean a lot of things to a lot of people, and at the end of the day, it's about finding hooks to talk about them. So we've suggested 4. Happy for feedback. We put out those 4 at the very beginning about a year ago. Didn't get any feedback, so we've just run with them. We're saying it's design excellence, it's sustainability, it's innovation, and it's community dividend. And we've tried to list out examples of what those things are. They might be seen as buzzwords, they might be examples, they might be inspiration, use them as you will, but hopefully it's just about getting that conversation started about the good development outcomes going on. Thanks.
To Natalie and Hannah, thank you very much. Some really very important points made there, I think, in a very simple use of language to bring those points across. So thank you very much for that. Certainly sparking some questions in my mind already, so I'll have to wait to the end. I'd like to introduce our next speaker to you now, Troy Webb. Troy is a partner in the Planning and Environment Group at McCulloch Robinson Lawyers. He acts for a number of Queensland local governments and for developers in relation to appeals and originating applications in the Planning and Environment Court. Troy is also a specialist in preparing infrastructure agreements. Troy is a former president of the QELA and has been a member of the QELA Management Committee for 10 years. Troy has also previously been part of the Peers Premium Seminar Series. I'm thinking it was 2012 we may have partnered together on writing conditions, if I remember. Yes. So this is not a new sphere for Troy to present to us tonight. Troy, I've had an opportunity to read Troy's paper this afternoon, is blending on top of the excellent paper we've already had from the consultant's perspective and looking at the Planning Act and the effect and the matters that the assessment manager for a local authority should have regard to. And I will now leave it there. Thank you very much, Troy.
Thank you. I'll just start by saying, of course, that there's really three main items that I wanted to cover in my paper today, and I'll go through that shortly. But I wanted to also say that, of course, I'm not a town planner, and I've never written a development application report. And Natalie has, of course, covered those very important practical tips. I guess rather I propose speaking based on my observations as a lawyer when reports are carefully scrutinised in the court process. I've tended to focus, because Natalie focused on the development application report writing, in my paper I've tended to focus on the council officer report because when there is a scrutiny process in court, it's often that report that's is the focal point for the proceeding. And I guess my paper still fits in with the theme of who's reading your report, because lawyers in the court will be looking at the report from a very different perspective to the number of stakeholders that Natalie mentioned. So the three main things I wanted to focus on is provide a bit of an overview of how council officer reports are commonly scrutinised, and I'll go into the content of what might be included in those reports. I'll also refer to how a court may have regard to the council officer report. There's often a bit of a misunderstood concept about what weight is actually given to the officer report in a proceeding. I'll then talk about the different roles and responsibilities of town planners in the assessment process compared to the roles and duties of an applicant or a council employee assessing an application versus crossing over to being a court expert witness. So in terms of the content of reports, there's just absolutely no doubt that the council officer report forms a critical part of the assessment manager's decision on a development application. There are a number of matters that need to be taken into account in the development application process, and as of 3 July, you've just been given some new matters that are relevant to the assessment and decision process. So there's different criteria under the Planning Act, but it's still criteria nonetheless, and it's something that you need to consider when preparing the application report. There's new requirements now for the provision of online notices, and in my view they provide a pretty good guide for at least the core matters that should be in the council officer report. So what are they? So the new online notice is required to be published after the decision is made by council. This compares with SPA when reasons for refusal, the focus under SPA was really reasons for refusal and grounds in the event of conflict. But the communication in that case was between the council and the applicant or the stakeholders such as submitters. This is a very new requirement. It's a publication of notice on the relevant authority's website, so it's a communication really to the community. So you need to describe the development, describe the applicable assessment benchmarks, and I think that term describe needs to go into a bit more than just listing out relevant codes. It seems to suggest you need to go into a little bit more and explain what's the relevant code that's applicable in this case from the perspective of the community so they understand it. And for impact assessment applications, any other relevant matters that are considered, and a description of the matters raised in submissions and how they are dealt with. That term, any other relevant matters, hasn't been tested yet. It replaces the traditional conflict and grounds test that was under SPA and the Integrated Planning Act. In my view, it probably, some of the points that Natalie was touching on in terms of positive language, is this a good development? Articulating that, I think, as the applicant planner to present in the event that there may be some non-compliance with the scheme, promoting that positive message about, well, notwithstanding that, there's still relevant matters that warrant approval. You have to go into the submissions and how they are dealt with, and I'll come back to shortly the reasons for the assessment manager's decision. This is very much a new requirement, and that applies to approvals and refusals. And you also need to go into, if you're approving something despite non-complying with the assessment benchmarks, you need to explain why that is the case. So what are reasons? What do we mean by reasons? And there's actually a clue in another act which helps interpreting the Planning Act, and that's the Acts Interpretation Act. So where an act says you need to give reasons or written reasons, there's two main things that you need to put in there. The first is you have to explain the finding on material questions of fact, and the second is you need to refer to the evidence or other material on which those facts were based. So the first requirement is I suppose, the what question. What facts were found by the decision maker that were relevant to the decision? And the second requirement is probably the why question. On what basis have the decision maker decided to go one way or the other? And what was the evidence that led to that finding? So there's findings of fact and the evidence that relates to it. And of course, quality development application reports will help provide that evidence, one would have thought. So what's the scrutiny then of these assessment reports? Often development application reports are required to be disclosed as part of a court proceeding, and they can also be obtained under the Right to Information Act, and they can be relevant to investigative procedures that other government agencies are involved in. And I should say it's relevant to the application material as well. It's not just the council internal communications of the report as well. It is very apparent when you're lodging a development application that you are submitting to a very public process. It doesn't mean to scrutinise everything that you do, but what you write can be relevant and can be disclosable. So you just have to bear that in mind when you're submitting the application. But of course, the weight to be given to the council officer report is dependent on the circumstances of the case, and I'll explain that shortly. So, you're a council officer, you've taken on board, taken care in preparing the report, you've addressed all the core matters, it's a solid assessment report, then somebody appeals the decision to the court, so what then? What weight is given to your officer report? And I can say that I have acted in a number of appeals for local governments where it's defending a refusal, and the interesting cases can be those where you're defending a refusal that was contrary to the officer's recommendation. And 9 times out of 10, as I'm sitting there at the bar table, I'll listen to the applicant's counsel open the case, and if it's not the first thing they say, it'll be very close to it, which is, Your Honour, council refused this application despite the advice of its technical council officers, to try and put the case in some context. But the issue there, of course, is hearings in the Planning and Environment Court are a hearing anew, and this is really a fresh hearing and a full merits review. So the council can actually, is not bound by its reasons for refusal that are put forward at the assessment stage. At the appeal stage, council can defend its decision and say, we reached the same conclusion, but for different reasons. And there's new issues that are articulated, and often new experts that give evidence in the case. So the court actually steps in the shoes of the council at that stage, and it considers things afresh, but what it considers are very different matters to what was before the council. And when you've been involved in that process, you'll see that the extent of material that's before the court is nothing like what was before the council. It's very much more extensive. So there is authority that says, there's a case called Bunnings, where Senior Judge Skanes said in response to the applicant's barrister that some weight should be given. Council is acting irrationally, it didn't accept the advice of its technical officers. But Senior Judge Skanes said to the effect that if the council officer who wrote the report is not called to give evidence, so far as the accuracy of the opinions expressed in that report are concerned, they're just simply hearsay. So what happens generally is that the council officer report at this appeal stage is part of the background material. There's appeal books that are usually prepared, bulky documents with all of the development application material, and the officer report is usually in there with them, but they're very much background material in those merits review appeals because there'll be different issues and different evidence that's called. Now, that contrasts, I think, with what I'd call judicial review. So if you think of merits review, that's usually forward-looking. It's looking at what's the new evidence, what's the new issues, and we can consider the whole thing afresh. Judicial review is different. Judicial review is more backward-looking. It's looking at what did the council take into account in making its decision, and essentially did it follow the correct process in doing so. So if you just assume for a minute we've got a code assessable application, the applicant doesn't exercise appeal rights, and there's prospects cause for a third party to challenge the decision. And those challenges can arise in probably two main instances: the commencement of declaratory proceedings in the P&E Court or the Supreme Court for jurisdictional error. So the argument really there is, well, I've had a look at this online notice and I think council hasn't taken into account a relevant code or hasn't taken into account something. And often the clue to whether that challenge is worthwhile or not can come from the council officer report. So in that type of proceeding, the officer report can be highly relevant to the issues in dispute. And of course, the public is armed with more information now with the online notices, which can then trigger an inquiry through RTI to get the council officer report, to potentially exercise rights to get statement of reasons for the decision, to under the Judicial Review Act, to find out whether legal rights might need to be pursued from people that weren't probably truly in the DA process. They're members of the community that have looked at the online notice. Now, I should say there's not a lot of these proceedings that are successful. Most of them fail because it's a very hard test. There's cases that say generally the opinion of the council should be accepted unless it's manifestly unreasonable. Council has taken into account totally relevant considerations, that type of thing. If others disagreed with it, the court said, well, that's by the way, really. So the challenges are not always successful. But if you've been through that process, it's not pleasant if you're the council or the council officer particularly, and also the applicant. I then wanted to touch on the potential dual roles in the application process for experts. So Natalie spoke about the DA planner being accountable to their client. And of course, local government employees are accountable to their council employer, but there's different roles for an expert witness. An expert witness actually owes a higher duty to the court. An expert in an appeal has a duty to not accept instructions or adopt or reject a particular opinion in relation to an issue in dispute in the proceeding. Now, that can be difficult for a town planner where you've got a client that's paying your fees, you've prepared your views in a development application, but in your role as an expert witness it's very much a different duty to the court, not to your client as the primary duty. So that then begs the question then, as a council officer, should you give evidence in the case if you've been involved in the development assessment process? And the same principles probably apply also to the applicant town planner if they're engaged and later called as an expert witness. So the scrutiny in those circumstances often goes to the credit of an expert witness based on their previous work, and inconsistencies will potentially be highlighted. So if a town planner is to embrace this expert witness role and do both, it highlights, I suppose, the care that needs to be taken in the DA report, because that's really the planner's views at that particular point in time, and if they differ under the scrutiny of cross-examination in a court, that's something that often barristers lick their lips about. So what about the council employee then? There is a case where the council employee gave evidence as an expert witness in the case, but the town planner was actually the council's delegate, so the actual decision maker for the application, as opposed to a professional involved in the process reporting to the decision maker. Now, in that case, the court said, look, it's not a reflection at all upon the experience or competence of the planner, but the report of that expert was really ascribed no weight. Again, not because of the language used, not because of the experience, but because of the court not treating it as really an independent view provided to the court, because essentially that expert was defending their own decision as a delegate. So that's where some real issues can arise in this process, because it must be remembered an expert is not intended to be a mere mouthpiece of their client and must exercise their own forensic judgment and impartial mind. So in conclusion, in relation to the 3 points that I wanted to discuss with you this evening, it's very much a greater transparency in decision making following the commencement of the Planning Act. There's more information out there in the public. Some councillors for a number of years have had PD Online, and that's been a source of information for the public, but that's actually got taken a step further, I think, under the Planning Act with the requirement for new online notices. The other thing I suppose I want you to be aware about is council officers' report, very integral to the application process, but once the decision's made, the weight to be given to it can differ depending upon the nature of the proceeding. And in an appeal, as I've said, often it's background material, and if that that author of that report is not called as a witness, it's simply hearsay. The other thing I just wanted to make you aware of is the different roles that you might play in the assessment process as the applicant planner or as the assessing planner, and whether you do take on that additional role as an expert witness in a court proceeding. And if you do, there's no problem in doing so, but you just have to be aware of that your opinions expressed earlier will be closely scrutinised for inconsistencies. Thank you. I think, Stephen, that's all I wanted to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Troy. Again, another very interesting perspective on preparing an assessment report, particularly in this situation from the point of view of an assessment manager within the council. And having been there and seeing some others in the room there, you get a load of 30, 35 files, and everyone wants their decisions and their applications processed at the time it's thinking to get that assessment report done to the required standard to encourage your delegate to make the decision that you were recommending. Today, some thought that perhaps you need to consider a bit further and be aware of where that can go after the decision has been made. And having been on the end of a declaratory action and having to sit in the court and explain to the judge why I got to my decision and what I had in my report, it is a rewarding but not necessarily pleasant experience. So again, I think we've had two very interesting presentations tonight that cover the singular broad topic but addressed from two different directions. We'll open it up to questions. I've got some, but we'll open up to questions from anybody else. Richard has got the mic for those in the room here this evening. Would you please identify your name and where you're from? And we'll also take some questions if there's been any that's been sent in from the live stream. So, anybody who's got the burning question they really must know before they go home tonight? Okay, well, I'll start then. And Natalie, to you, you were speaking, you started at the start of your presentation and you touched on with the slide about being careful to not speak in a defensive situation. And you were presenting that from the consultant preparing the application, so not trying to defend everything but to be positive. But you said you're starting to see that occurring more and more from both sides. What do you think might be the reason why that's occurring? What's changed or what is changing that's making us become more defensive?
Oh, look, I think, thank you. I think there's a lot of pressures going on everywhere, and I think we appreciate that. I think it's an interesting time to be a planner, and I say that in a positive sense, but also it is challenging. There's a lot of things going on at a macro level. I think we always hear about the great urban shift, you know, the growth pressures, the doubling of the city populations in the next 25 years, and that growth not being welcome at the edges, but right in our backyards or in infill development in our existing urban areas. I think communities take notice of that, and they're seeing a lot of developments in their street, in their backyard, in their community, and they're you know, worried about what that development's going to be. There's communities that are rallying against density in their areas or protecting the neighbourhood character of their area, and they're fearful of what's being proposed. And I think you know, the media certainly perpetuates that. There's been some studies about the types of language that Queensland newspapers use when they're describing development, and it's very it's, I'm not sure the word, it sort of references war and you know, ripping the heart out of our suburbs, you know, death and destruction. And I think those pressures, I think people feel those pressures, and politicians feel those pressures, and the council officers feel those pressures. And, you know, as planning practitioners, we understand that those pressures exist, and there's a lot of, you know, there's a lot more dialogue about planning and development outcomes and development decisions, and we probably do start to get a little bit defensive when people talk about them in the light that they do if we feel differently. So I think it's a natural behaviour. I think it's also perhaps, you know, that it is a litigious area. We're under scrutiny. You know, I think I don't mean we just see it in report writing. I think we see it in the attitudes, in impact assessable development. We're seeing it even in permissible changes. There's a bit of a fear of, you know, pushing an envelope too far, and so I think we, you know, just need to get out on the front foot and talk about, you know, it's not so much that we don't still have to defend why it is a good development, but I just say don't talk in the defensive. Let's actually get out there and highlight the positives, and then show how they meet the performance outcomes. Or, as you know, Troy says, if there is some conflict with the scheme, let's say why, you know, what we're doing about that, and why this is a better outcome in this instance.
Thank you. Very good. Richard, we have a question down there in the middle.
My name is Samaya. I'm from Cardno. I just have a quick question. I missed the name of the open source GIS program that you would recommend. What was the name?
Sure. So it's the long name is Quantum GIS, but if you just Google it, type in QGIS, and you can basically just download it for free.
Thanks.
It's all right.
Thank you, Richard.
We have an online question. Listening to Troy re-emphasised to me the age-old fear, in brackets, covering your backside, that it is better and safer for a council planner to refuse an application than approving it, even if it will be a fantastic development. How can we overcome this?
think I need a mic, sorry. Certainly didn't want to convey the attention, Natalie will not like me if I did, that I'm talking about refusal covering backside. I suppose as a professional you will do that naturally. You will look at the application carefully. The good thing is if you've got a quality application before you, you're really at a good starting point, and if you don't, you still have the powers to make information requests to get more information. The new Planning Act and DA rules also give the assessment manager the ability to request further advice from the applicant, and that can include how that might change the application to address their concerns. There's a range of tools, I suppose, that can be there that can be very positive in terms of approvals for applications. But it can still, each case will depend on its own merits, I suppose. And in cases where there's refusals, then it's just about whether that's justifiable ultimately through the scrutiny of the court, because refusals will probably be appealed. And there are many cases that settle, possibly arising because the applicant has changed the proposal, possibly through a joint expert process. So definitely refusal shouldn't be the starting point. The correct legal answer is you just look at what the criteria provide to you for decision making, and if you don't have enough information, use your information request power to get that, or ask for further, or give further advice to the applicant.
That was a question from Cecil in Dolby.
Thank you. Any others there at all from the floor? I'll ask another one to Sarah. Particularly in this situation, you were talking about the quality assurance checklists. You're also talking about being careful how you use the language in your report where you've relied upon external experts or your different disciplines. Not so much in the writing of your report, you've talked about that, but in the management of your practice, how do you go about ensuring the quality or at least consistency of your experts' reports and your assessment report?
Yeah, so I think we go through a process of, obviously we review all of our consultants' reports as they come in, and we provide feedback and request minor changes, and also just always try to make sure that they are consistent with one another and with the most up-to-date set of plans that we've got. And then by inputting them into our own report and having something like a QA checklist, which could include an item, have you reviewed the consultant reports and have you checked for X, Y, Z, sort of tick these boxes whether all of these matters have been addressed. I think that's basically how we go about it.
Okay, so you're building, so having a practice to start with and then building in potentially a checklist. Again, from an assessment manager's side, nothing more frustrating to read an assessment report that says one thing, potentially in glowing positive verse, an architectural plan that says something else, and then an engineer's or a traffic report that says something completely different. Taking on Troy's advice that we have the ability for an information request, but it's not a good start that way. So putting those things in place can help to lead to that.
Can I just make an observation on that one as well? I think, you know, maybe it's a small thing, but our practice is to have a planning report, and then you know, part of the planning report is obviously to bring in all of these issues and integrate them into, you know, what we're saying and what we're concluding. But then all of the technical consultant reports are actually part of the appendices of our report. So I guess it's just a simple thing, and at the end of the day, whether it's an appendix to our report or a separate report might not seem overly important, but at the end of the day it gives us an accountability, so we can't use that excuse to say, oh well, you know, that report came in later, or that's a report from someone else. We're taking some ownership of it and making it all part of one assessment report. It's not a planning report and a traffic report, it's an assessment report which is written typically by the planner with everyone's input, and then has everyone else's technical report as an appendix.
Sorry, can I just touch on that? It's probably more to do with detail and appendices from the perspective of the court. and looking at the town planning joint report. I have heard from the court that there's issues raised in the appeal, and often they're quite detailed. The courts wants to ensure that that's covered off, but often it's dealt with in appendices or it's dealt with at the back of the report. The key evidence, I suppose, is the court just wants to know your views as a town planner and how you express that in your report up front, getting the key messages across early. That's really what adds value, I think, to the decision the court needs to be made. Knowing that you're ticking off on the issues in dispute, it's in there, it's down the back in the appendix.
Any more questions at all? Anything further from the live stream? Okay, I think we'll say thank you very much to our presenters. I'll ask you to show your support. And I'll take that opportunity again to let you know about our upcoming events. August is going to be a busy month. Lots of great things there, and planners, lovely comment, albeit Wikipedia, that we are storytellers and we tell stories in different places depending on the type of work we're doing. So there's a little bit for everybody in the month of August. Please think about attending some of those, and then looking at our website for the additional seminars coming up between now and the end of the year. Thank you to everybody.